Hey YouTube, it's your girl Dr. J, and I thought I would come in and do a quick video on the differences in Singapore math, because I know that I have talked quite a bit about how I prefer Singapore math US edition to Singapore math US standards edition, and I've talked about that, but I didn't really do I think a good job of like showing what the differences were. So today, that's what I'm going to do. This is Singapore Math Primary Mathematics Standards Edition. So think of state standards when you think of this book. And then this is Singapore Math US Edition. Now, there's a couple of things that you will see right off the back as differences. In the US edition, which is what I really like, you'll see that throughout the textbook there is shading all of the same color, whereas in the standards book you will see a lot more colors throughout. And some people may actually really like that. But for us, since my kids have some vision issues, it's actually easier on their eyes to just have the shading of one color, as opposed to having, their eyes have the stress of going from green to red to yellow to blue. So just having that more gentle just shading is something that I like. Another thing that you can see just from cosmetics alone is that in the US edition book, again, this is the one that I really like, there are a total of 104 pages, and in the standards edition there's a glossary and all that kind of stuff that's in addition, but basically there are 154 pages of text. So you can see that that's a pretty big difference. And if you guys have watched my Common Core Standards versus Japanese Math and Singapore Math, you'll actually see that one of the big differences is that the United States students spend a lot more time doing math than they do in other countries. So that goes in line with the State Standards Edition, where you're going to have a lot more requirements for the students to do a lot more repetition, even though it isn't having the desired effect of having them do better on tests, but we still do that with state standards. But a lot of what you'll see in the two books is that there's a lot of similarity. For instance, the first page of text that the students will deal with in the state standards book, it looks like this. Okay? And for the US edition, the first page of text that students will deal with looks like this. So you can see it's pretty much the exact same information, it's just that one is shaded and one is full color. What they cover is going to be very similar. Okay, so the first 4 chapters are similar, but the 5th chapter in the US 3A book is on money, and the 5th chapter in the 3A State Standards book is actually going to be on data analysis. So that's one of the first larger differences that you'll encounter. Another difference that you'll encounter is with mental math, mental calculation. That is introduced in the State Standards book early. It's going to be in chapter 2 when they review addition and subtraction, whereas mental math is not introduced until 3B in the US Standards edition. I actually like that it's not introduced until 3B, and the reason is because mental math is all about speed and fluency, and I really like that you make sure your child understands the math before there's a push to make it fast. But it makes sense to make it fast early in the State Standards Edition, mainly because students have to get prepared for standardized tests. And when you take a standardized test, you really need to speed. So it makes sense that it's introduced early in the Standards Edition, but since we don't have to rely on standardized testing, I really don't want to push speed over comprehension. So that's one of the reasons why I like the US edition. another reason why I like the U.S. edition, and it's something that is a subtle difference, is in word problems. You can see word problems are introduced. This is in the State Standards edition. And the first word problem that they encounter, it says, Mary made 686 paper flowers. She sold some of them. If 298 were left over, how many flowers did she sell? Now this is basically a simple subtraction problem, but I had two issues with the way this was written. The first was that I didn't like the flow of the question. When it says like she sold some of them and then more information, I kind of didn't like the way that the sentence structure was. But also 686 minus 298, that's a fairly complex subtraction problem for a third grader, especially the fact that it's introduced in just chapter 2 of book A, where they're, if they've taken a break at all from schooling, they may, really be kind of brushing up. And for you to have a lot of calculation in a first word problem, that's kind of challenging, because if they get the problem wrong simply because they did their calculations wrong, that kind of discourages a little bit with their use of word problems. Whereas word problems in Singapore Math US edition, you'll see it is introduced as two-step word problems. And the first word problem says Jamie picked 17 flowers and Lindsay picked 12. They gave away 20 of the flowers. How many flowers were left? One of the things I really like about that is that it actually introduces a much more complex word problem, because this word problem has two steps, but you have much more simple calculations. So the emphasis for the student is really on understanding how to do word problems without getting so much caught up in the calculations. And then once they understand word problems well, then you move to more complex calculations. Whereas in the State Standards edition, I think the emphasis was on really do the calculation right, but not really have the complexity that a third grader really is ready for when it comes to word problems. So that's another reason why I really like the U.S. standards. It introduces a lot of mental complexity and pushes the child in their understanding of mathematics, but doesn't get too bogged down in creating opportunities for the children to make calculation errors before they really get good at just fluency and that sort of piece of calculation that comes with time. These are the workbooks. This is the Primary Mathematics State Standards 3A workbook, and this is the U.S. Standards 3A workbook. Again, you will see the difference in page number of pages in the State Standards book. You can see there are 184 pages, whereas in the U.S. Standards, again, this is the one that I like, you have a total of 150 pages in the workbook. So again, you have, a little bit of difference in the amount of work that students are doing. And we see that because the first few pages of the workbook, like the first chapter for 3A, both versions of 3A is calculations to 10,000. And you're going to see the exact same problems all the way through page 16. So the problems are going to be exactly the same in each workbook. Okay, page 16. Page 16, exact same page. But then, for the next exercise in the State Standards book, you move on to kind of exercise 5, where you're still dealing with kind of that particular flow, where you're still kind of in that first chapter of work. Whereas in the U.S. Standards, you move on to a different type of math, where you're letting the kids kind of find the differences and that sort of stuff. So it tends to do a lot more of putting things in bite-sized chunks and giving just a little bit of repetition as opposed to a lot of repetition. And so I like that. I like the flow of the problems a little bit better in the US edition as opposed to the standards edition. Another thing that's a subtle difference, but it's one that I find important, and that is in the state standards, or what I call state standards, but standards edition for 3B, that this is a new book. But you will see that for the chapters, it says 6. So instead of it really appearing like a new book, it just goes on to book B really being, okay, now you're in chapter 6. The first book was 5 chapters. Whereas in the standards, in the US edition, okay, the edition that I like, for book B, you will start with chapter 1. I actually like that because it gives the child a sense that they finished a book. And so, you can celebrate, have a party, eat some cake. Your child knows, I finished this book. As opposed to if they go to book B and they see chapter 6, it's like, okay, you weren't really finished. This is just the continuation. So it just makes the child feel like, to me, they've accomplished something. It's something like mental about, finishing the book and then moving on and then going to something new. Another reason why I like this book is because the B book for the US edition as opposed to the standards edition is because with every time, for those who have been homeschooling a long time, you know that when your child starts a new math book, there's always some review of things that were learned already, just to make sure it's fresh with your child. And that's the same with book B. That's when we do mental calculation. So that's really just where they go over a refresher of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and they're going to use mental math so that your child will gain speed in it. So they get that review and they're going to get faster in that second book, whether that's your second semester, whether your child finishes the first book in 5 weeks and then goes to the second book. It doesn't matter. It's basically going to build in that refresher for your child so things stay fresh for them, as opposed to the standards book 3B. That first chapter is length and then weight, and so they actually will not do a refresher and focus on speed in this second book. All of that kind of basic calculation stuff is done in the first book, and then they're using it in B, and they use this, many of the same things in book A for the standards edition. But I kind of like that refresher of calculations, because everything that your child is going to do in mathematics, throughout life, is going to be addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. That's it. That's all you can do with numbers, pretty much. And so constantly having them understand it more deeply and get faster with it and continue to be refreshed in it. I really like the built-in aspects of the refresher that you see in the US edition as opposed to the standards edition or US standards edition. So as you guys can see, that is why I have chosen, to like the US edition as opposed to the standards edition. You guys know we actually use EPGY math for the base or the spine for my kids' math, but we do use Singapore as well. We use Singapore as a standalone actually last year before we started with EPGY, and we will keep Singapore math all the way through 6th grade and then on to some other areas. But you guys know I like to have my kids do things in a lot of different ways, so we never rely on just one program. And Singapore math is going to follow us through our math as well, because it's just a great different way for my kids to learn math. But we will only be using the US edition. We will not be using the state standards edition. So if anybody wants it, let me know. All right, this is Dr. J, and I'm out. Bye-bye.